Okay, so today we're going to resume bondoing and sanding and priming and rinse and repeating the Mandalorain helmet. So obviously you can see that I have started with the Bondo already. I wanted to get my bearings with it before I started making any recordings of it. So I did a layer over here, just on this kind of quadrant here, filling in this seam and such beforehand so I could get used to it. And then this was sanded down, and the rest of this on the helmet was done in one sitting. You can see some spots where it kind of hardened a bit before I could smooth it out from using too much hardener, so they kind of globbed up. I'm hoping to sand that down really easily. But today I'm going to go and sand this outside with an orbital sander, and then we will coat it with some filler primer, wait for that to dry, and then mark down any irregularities that need to be patched up again. I mentioned in the video about building this sanding tub, this stuff kicks up way too much dust for me to be comfortable doing it even in a mostly sealed box like this. It is awful for your health to be breathing it. So I'm going to take my orbital sander outside to a community patio that my apartment has and sand that over there. And that way the dust kicks it up and away from my building and from me. So I'm gonna go out there and we're going to use an orbital sander just to sand it. I'm gonna use about 120 grit, maybe 80 grit if it's not enough. Sand it down smooth and then brush off the dust and then fill it in with some filler primer. And we are going to be using this Rust-Oleum filler primer. I had this back from a while ago when I built an arcade tabletop. I'm just going to use this. We'll do an initial layer here, and then we'll wait for it to dry, and then come back once that's done. We'll mark any irregularities, and then it'll be Bondo, sanding, filling, rinse, and repeat. So I will be back in just a minute after I've gone outside and sanded this for a good who knows how long. So this is what it looks like after we did our first coat of Bondo and some filler primer. Off camera, I went ahead and circled out some of the defects that came in or that are visible from my job. So there are some things here you can see I sanded a bit too much, and we can see some of the print lines. And then there's just some general scuffs and stuff, things that need to be filled in, dings, nicks, and such. But I'm going to go back in now and fill in all of these things with some extra Bondo. Doesn't need an entire new coat, just needs patch jobs on most of all of these places. I gotta sand out a bunch. The Mohawk is almost kind of invisible because there's so much Bondo built up on the edges until you can see where it was sanded down enough to see it. So got some work to do on it. I'm gonna go and get some Bondo on it. And if I haven't said it already, don't do that indoors. Bondo is awful for you in any sense of physiology. So wear a mask, wear a respirator, wear gloves, do it outside in a well-ventilated area. And let's get to round two. So this is after a second coat of Bondo to fill in some patch jobs, and then sand it down again to make it as smooth as I could possibly get it. So what we're gonna do now, I'm gonna go back outside, spray down another coat of primer on it, some filler primer, so that we can fill in some of these holes again that popped up, and that way we can see if there's any big spots left to fill in and sand. And then once that's done, we can go ahead and paint it. One thing I did was, while sanding this, I kept a bucket of water nearby and wet a paper towel or an old sponge and wipe it down, because there are some spots that I never noticed, like on the back here. I can see some now, but when you're sanding, they get filled in with dust, and then wiping them away with a dry hand or towel isn't always going to reveal some of these holes. So I found like a wet sponge or wet paper towel, wiping it away shows these a lot better, and then you can go back and sand them until they're smooth again. So that really helped a lot if you need any advice on doing that. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually using dental picks to go in and scrape out some of the Bondo that had gotten wedged into these detail lines across the helmet. So over time, as I was pushing the Bondo into the different divots that needed it, it got mistakenly put into the detail lines in the Mohawk and the front brow, and it needed to be cleaned out. And I found that dental picks were actually a really good way to scrape this stuff out without really damaging the helmet, so long as you're careful and the picks are sharp. It does a really good job of getting this stuff out. After that was done, I just went and I washed it off quickly in my sink to remove any dust, and then we moved on to the next step. So what I'm doing here is, I believe, my third coat of Bondo on the helmet. I went outside to avoid any fumes, and I used a marshmallow skewer that you use to roast marshmallow to mix together the Bondo, and then a gloved hand to rub it into all the spots that needed it. I found using things like a putty knife was too broad and it didn't work as well, so I just used a finger to get wherever I needed it, smooth it out as even as I could possibly get, let it set, and then sand it. As I needed to get into any detail spots, I used the skewer that I mixed the stuff with just to kind of pick up a little glob of it and then work it into the detail spots to make everything look like it was smooth and joined. Doing it this way actually turned out really well, and this was my second to last filling of Bondo before the helmet was done. So here's what some of it looks like after about half a coating of primer. I unfortunately ran out. I didn't realize how little I had left in my can, and it was my only can left. And because of that, it led to some spurts of primer kind of getting blasted everywhere. So there's some pooling that happened, some draining, not some light draining, but some light drips and stuff kind of happened as a consequence of the can being so low and not really realizing it. But these will be easy to sand down. But we can see already with some primer on it, it already looks so much better after some sanding from the second coat of Bondo and all the holes and stuff we filled in. This top part of the head is already very smooth. I just need some minimal filling with Bondo and sanding to get down these puddles and stuff. So I need to go get a new can this weekend, finish that off, finish priming this, and then seeing what needs to be worked on with sanded and some extra Bondo. But it's already looking so good. I'm super excited to get back at it after I get a new can of paint. After I got my replacement can of filler primer and finished spray painting it, I moved on to what was probably, I think, the last step before paint, and that was wet sanding this thing smooth. So here I'm using a sandpaper of about 1,000 grit. I did this indoors with everything staying wet so that once everything was sanded, all the dust and stuff was stuck to the sandpaper and I could wash it away and it wasn't getting skewed up into the air and causing any kind of damage or harm. So as you just saw in the little time lapse, I just did a small sanding job on it with about 1,000 grit sandpaper, wet sanding, to get a very smooth and shiny finish. This is actually really smooth to the touch. So as a quick recap of what we've done in the last few minutes of video, we sanded down the initial big glob of Bondo filler that we put on this thing to give it the first layer, and then we filled it with filler primer to fill in some gaps and show us some of the blemishes that we missed that needed more sanding or Bondo filling. And then we rinsed and repeated Bondo filling, sanding, priming until we've reached this spot. There are some things you can kind of see on the camera that are from some of the sanding I did, but I do believe that once we paint it, they won't be very visible. This is more of a slight reflecting on the sanding marks and stuff. And some of it is also still wet, which is doing that as well. So we did that about 5 times. I'm going to clean up some small blemishes with these detail lines here and even these out. But after full 5 coats of primer, full 5 coats of primer and then 4 decreasing amounts of Bondo in between the lines of primer, we have reached this stage. So that is kind of the end of this part of prepping for paint. I'm really happy with how it turned out. There are some things, like I said, I'm just going to finish off camera, like evening out some detail lines and trying to fix some small things without doing any big coats of Bondo or primer or anything, just so I don't have to go through all of that again. But I'm hoping tomorrow we can do our first coat of paint. It's about 6:30 and it's pitch black outside where I am. So tomorrow morning we're going to give it our first coat of paint, and I'll recap what my plan is for that in that part of this video. But a real quick glimpse at it now, we're basically going to do a few coats, probably 2 or 3 coats of Rust-Oleum dark steel, sanded in between coats, rub in some graphite powder to give it a more metallic and reflective look, and then a few coats of clear gloss finish to protect it all. So I'll run through that again in my painting part of this, which I'll start hopefully tomorrow. But for now, we are pretty much done with priming and filling, and I'm super happy with how this turned out. It's my very first time ever doing something like this, and I'm super thrilled with it. So I'll see you guys in the painting part of this, and we're almost done.